is our next speaker. To lead out after Gregg, we have Gregg Servheen. Gregg is the Wildlife Program Coordinator with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. He's going to be talking to us a little bit about wildlife habitat impacts as well as development. Gregg Servheen is currently a Wildlife Program Coordinator in the Idaho Department of Fish and Game in Boise. In this position, he focuses on habitat-related issues, including land acquisition, assessing development impacts in priority conservation areas, developing and implementing mitigation, and implementing wildlife-related research. He has been an employee of the department for more than 25 years and has worked as a research and management staff biologist in Bonners Ferry, Lewiston, and Boise, Idaho. So I hope you join me in welcoming Gregg. And Gregg, please go ahead whenever you're ready. Thank you.
All set. Thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to talk to folks today. And I'd really just like to take a moment as I start here to just kind of, sitting back in the audience, that exactly what we're doing here. The Society of Range Management in Idaho, what's viewed as a very traditional, historic user and sort of culture in the state of Idaho and across the West, is in a networked meeting that is across the state using high technology and is focused on energy development on rangelands. It's not about stock per se or any of those. So I very much want to just appreciate, what the chapter is doing here and what you're willing to engage with as you look at rangelands and range management and the culture of the communities about range and what needs to be addressed: energy, wildlife, policy, technical information, restoration. This is really fantastic, and I really salute you for taking this approach and moving this ahead, and also appreciate the fact that a traditional context of 1 foot on the traditional side and also 1 foot to the modern in the future, and willing to engage both to keep things moving ahead. And I very much appreciate that and salute you for it. So moving ahead here to try and see if I can make everything work. I just want to maybe have 4 main topics to talk about today. Just to give a context of energy development at least is the Department of Fish and Game as we look at it. The role of the department, touch upon how we interact and perhaps what that means relative to accomplishments or input. Then in terms of fish and wildlife management, maybe some of what the main issues are, or divide that up a little bit. And then some of the emerging issues I'd like to talk about in terms of perhaps what needs to be addressed or what we're looking into and trying to move forward. In terms of energy projects, this was just our short list. I'd like to salute, I did this with the help of our regional staff across the state, and sort of gathered with them and just sort of did a brain dump about what's going on in your neck of the woods. And this is sort of our sum of the folks who know what's going on, and put the whole pile together, looking at, at least 45 different wind projects, 7 large, potentially large transmission, with 3 smaller ones, 3 solar, 9 geothermal, 2 nuclear, and 2 pipelines within the state of Idaho. And I think it's safe to say predominantly the southern portion of the state. So this is all a concentrated effort, and obviously a lot going on. So timely and important issues. On the other side of that is, I want to talk about it, looking at energy development. It doesn't come in and of itself. It's not its own little item. And as you all know, it has the same sort of context and the same issues related to things on transportation as well as other land use issues. So in looking at these in the overlap, certainly related to wildlife, we look at them in much the same way. In this context, we'll focus on energy today, but there's a lot of overlap in terms of how we look at it and potential impacts. In terms of energy permitting in Idaho, it's very important in terms of what is the purpose of the Department of Fish and Game in terms of fish and wildlife impacts, and how is that met. I'd just say call it safe to say that energy permitting is widely varied throughout the state. It's left open, so a county might have absolutely no requirements of any permits at all for any kind of, let's say, wind development, while a county right next door to it might have specific requirements and also make those in terms of mitigation and monitoring. And the state has generally a hands-off approach to things and is not so much interested in the regulatory side as just provide information and assist, as John mentioned earlier, assist in the development of this energy and power, that this is seen as a positive economic activity, and the best way is to try to facilitate that. And then as best met locally, how is that permitted? Some of the problems that that's running into are these much larger projects like transmission lines, which run across many counties and as I mentioned earlier, several states. And what that gets into from the proponent side, even those who want to move these ahead, they get frustrated with the fact of the variation in permitting puts them in a frustration factor in terms of trying to move something ahead that's very large and needs to be dealt with in hopefully one way. So it's sometimes you're on the right side of the fence, sometimes you're on the wrong side of the fence, depending on that variance of the permitting. But that just does give you some idea of maybe how we're dealing with it. You have to be nimble. So in terms of the state of Idaho and our agency, we are not a permitter. We are not a regulatory agency whatsoever in terms of any energy projects. We take no position on energy projects. We neither oppose nor promote projects. What we do primarily is we have an approach in which we have our list of any development projects which we look at in terms of avoid, minimize, and then mitigate. And that's the general context that we like to approach the projects on from a non-regulatory side, and look at it in terms of providing information that helps make decisions. And in this case, looking at this sage-grouse map, which is, you can say, first is specific to Idaho, but also transcends boundaries and deals with a course level look at what are priority areas. And hopefully that's the kind of information we can put out there early to help us with that avoid part, because that's the first most important thing we want to try and do is say, in terms of development and wildlife, these are our important areas, and try to make that information as readily available as early as possible to get to that avoid part first, and allow the proponent to make those decisions about what should go where and why. And if it's such that a transmission line or a wind power issue runs right smack into a core area, they're made aware of it and they still proceed ahead, then we're on what we see as a constructive dialogue in terms of what the resources are and then how those issues will be met. So again, the department is primarily is into problem solving. We're there to devise the issues, determine what the status of the resource is. That's one of the first thing we want to provide, the status of the resource. Talk about the potential development itself and what is proposed, so we need an idea of what the actual project is. We like to, when we're into a siting context, what is this? What does it mean in terms of roads, location, potential ground disturbance, all those sorts of things to then allow us to take the status of the resource, turn that into a potential impacts assessment, and then provide that in terms of input to the decision makers so that they have a context of what this means in terms of the wildlife resource. So we're looking to try to do that, and do that sort of in a filter context. Again, first to look at avoid, then look at minimizing, then look at mitigating. And as we look at this, as we do this assessment, we obviously look at all the information that we have in our databases regarding all the fish and wildlife species in the state of Idaho, and bring those that are most relevant to the topic to the fore. So we look at that in terms of the individual species and what we have for there, and then the relationship that the project would play in terms of the habitat. Look at those direct impacts, as was mentioned in some of the earlier slideshows, whether it's direct mortality, and then indirect, which would include actual loss of habitat or potentially habitat avoidance because of disturbance or whatever else might be occurring. Then look at the potential of cumulative effects. What else is going on besides this single project or perhaps others, and how are they cumulatively affecting sage grouse or elk winter range as a whole? Look in terms of the duration of the disturbance. Is this going to be a single year, 12 months, 40 years? Give it that context, and then look at the potential for adaptation, both in terms of the impact as well as the wildlife. And all through this, looking, the basis is the fish and wildlife that we're talking about, but also what's important, very important to the people of the state of Idaho, is the fish and wildlife-based recreation. So what are the implications for hunting and fishing, public access, and viewing and appreciation of Idaho's fish and wildlife? And we try to weave that into the context of our discussion of projects. So on that avoid, minimize, mitigate, we talked about first the avoid context of things. On the minimize, that's where we get into the assessment and then make recommendations as potentially, if a tower was sited over here, it might have less impact on these raptor nests or potential golden eagles, those sorts of things. So that minimization, we take that as best management practices, and I think those were alluded to in some of the earlier talks. Minimizing is how could this project best be designed to minimize its impact? Could, let's say, only build it during the summer, so if it's on winter range, it would have minimal effect. Site the towers away from sage grouse leks to minimize their effect, those sorts of things. Then when we get to the end, that's at the point where the project in and of itself has been designed as well as potentially could be in terms of wildlife, and as well as the project proponent saying, we've done our best. Then at that point, we look at the potential impacts and look to mitigate those themselves. And in that context, we look at it in terms of how can we mitigate and how can the project have a net benefit to wildlife in and of itself. So I'm making this point specifically because it's important. Every project potentially could have an impact, and if we want to know what that impact is, we try to clearly identify that, tie it back to what's going on there, and then we want to try and talk about the mitigation. But the idea is not to continue the declining curve using sage grouse, for example, and keep reducing the impact but still having an impact. What we want to do is level it out so there is none or have a net benefit, so that we're on a positive side of the resource management side, while at the same time hopefully seeking a positive outcome with the project and its development. So I mentioned that in terms of seeking net benefit as we look at the mitigation and the effects of a project. So some of the emerging issues and opportunities maybe you just wanted to touch on here. Again, hit these three pieces. One is the mitigation question. I think that Will mentioned this earlier, and I think this is one that we're wrestling with in the state of Idaho. Also, the idea of adaptive management. The loop was actually alluded to in the previous discussion about restoration and how we need to think of these in a cyclic adaptive approach, and then talk about the work we're doing with the Western Governors Association in the development of this CHAT, or Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool, that we're looking to help with decision support. So in terms of mitigation, I think what's important here in terms of energy development in the state of Idaho is so much of this is unknown and undetermined. There's a big push for energy development, a lot of potential impacts that we're trying as carefully as possible to identify, but we lack a lot of information, I think, as both or all the talks have alluded to so far. So we have very little information. A lot of it is, well, what effects does wind development have on sage grouse? Well, we think it'll have an impact, but we don't know. We think it'll have a bad impact, but we don't know how bad. And so on one level, it's like, how do we have the project go forward? And then how do we continue to manage sage grouse sustainably so that we keep that resource solid and healthy in the state of Idaho? So that's where on the mitigation side, we're looking to get that to where we feel we've got a good handle on that that the project can be allowed to move forward, and we have mitigation such that we feel, once again, that we've got it where it can be of a net benefit, and that can be proven by some good scientific monitoring, both in was our mitigation effective, in that if we were trying to, let's say we lost sage-grouse habitat, we needed to mitigate for it, did in fact that turn into sage-grouse habitat? We don't know whether that's true or not. We would like to monitor that effect. And also on the mitigation side, did in fact we mitigate it? If we said we were going to restore 100 acres, did we restore 100 acres? And think of this in the context of 40-year energy projects that potentially could have scattered or cumulative effects across the state. So I think within the state of Idaho, the point I'm trying to make here is that mitigation in and of itself needs to be dealt with, and we need to develop a good, strong policy and approach to this where we're confident in the outcomes of that as the same as we're confident of the need for those projects and their ability to provide us the energy we're looking for. Similarly, on the adaptive management side, this goes to the fact that we have so many unknowns on the wildlife side. The focus now is on sage-grouse, and the big concerns, as you know, about that relationship to what's going on with rangelands. But if we couple that with fire and invasive weeds and the issues that range managers like yourselves are dealing with, that's where we need a lot more data and information that we think will help managers, users, the public, recreationists, all benefit. So we think in an adaptive management context, we need to sort of very carefully design how the science is going to provide information to what's going on out there, and then how that information will then help policies and management adapt as it changes, realizing we can't just freeze and not move ahead until we have the science. We aren't in a situation to do that. But at the same time, we can't move ahead blindly without information, as you all know, relative to whether you're running the business or you're trying to manage the public lands out there. It's important we have some good objective information. It must be scientifically devised and put in an adaptive management loop. I think that's the sort of thing we need to build into our decisions. And I can't remember which talk it was. The idea that maybe it was in the BLM, the decisions are generally made in an EA or an EIS. They're terminated, and then the project's implemented and is on the land for 40 years. Well, the decision did this thing for 40 years that's on the land, that rides with the land for 40 years. Somehow we must make that decision actually be more dynamic so that it is continuing to build the collaboration that we're talking about here in terms of energy and livestock management and range health and sage-grouse, and providing the information that helps all those users and all those issues move ahead and advance in terms of science and information over the 40 years of the life of the project. And I think that's some of the things we need to look at in terms of an adaptive management context to those decisions, whether they're in the county level or public lands. And then finally, with the Western Governors Association, and we're working with them and through them on their initiative on this development of this chat, which we call our Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool. And this is basically just using decision support, the technology these days, as you all know, to try and help those computers help us do a better job. So because of the Western Governors Association and their initiative with concerns about wildlife and wildlife corridors as energy development proceeded across the entire 18 states of the West, including Alaska, they got together and said they wanted to develop the data and information across all 18 states, and they wanted that to help facilitate energy development and make good decisions about that in terms of resource management. So in the abbreviated form, we started out in 2010 with the Governors Association funded through the Department of Energy to do some pilots across the West. We started with 8 different pilots to try and see if our states could match their information, because traditionally that's how we gathered, collected, and assessed our information is state by state. So when you came to the boundary, the lines went like this. And so if Montana sage-grouse line and Idaho sage-grouse line went like this, that really didn't do you too good if you were trying to make a trans-boundary decision. And it didn't do you too good if you're also trying to manage sage-grouse in their entirety rather than state by state. So through those pilots, we've progressed in terms of how we're going to move this. So we're going to a west-wide approach in developing our information to look at species and habitats of concern, look at landscape integrity as a very coarse filter to help us with evaluating habitats and wildlife. And then we're looking at our terrestrial game and sport fish, because that's very much been a state-by-state approach and needs a lot of work to kind of work together. We're looking at how to roll this up across the West to make it so it's a wall-to-wall look, and then a regional viewer, basically how you call this up on the web, have it pop up and have it inform you if you're a proponent trying to put in a transmission line or wind, help you decide where to go and why, and if you're going to go somewhere, what the potential risks are that you're taking on in terms of wildlife. So we're moving through with this. We're in phase 2 of development of this chat across the West, as well as all the individual states working on their own individual chat simultaneously. And we're hoping to roll those out by 2013. And again, this is a salute to the Western governors to say that we need to make this happen, and recognizing this comes from both the importance of fish and wildlife and what that means across the West, as well as the need for energy and how to do that in a sustainable way. So we're taking these crucial habitats in our data sets and look at those in terms of unfragmented habitat connectivity areas, the various ecological systems, species of concern, putting them in a GIS, all geospatially referenced, so that then we can provide these maps and have that as a web-based tool to provide the proponents and help with decision making, certainly on these energy projects that are very large, but also hopefully get us to more finer, detailed information that would help with all kinds of other decision making related, as I mentioned before, land use, energy, transportation. So again, I just kind of touched on development in the state of Idaho. Here, give you some context of what the role of the department is, touched on the permitting side of things, how we're sort of wrestling with some of the fish and wildlife management questions, and then the emerging issues about how we need to kind of grapple a little bit better with what our mitigation policy is going to look like and how we're going to implement mitigation. Talked about the need to take an adaptive management approach and how we're working with all our other states across the West on this crucial habitat assessment tool, and hopefully that will be of great benefit to whether you're a project developer looking to put energy out there or make something happen that we all need in society, or looking to do conservation and want to know where the best place to do and what's a priority. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. If I haven't put you to sleep in the mid-afternoon doldrums, have another cookie. Yes. So the question is whether or not there's a discussion in the state of Idaho to put together like a siting committee. It might include folks from Fish and Wildlife as well as other resource representation to try and assist with that decision making. My answer is not that I'm aware of it at my level of things, and I think that is coming from the context of we have the county level decision making, we have the state level decision making, then we have private lands and public lands. So between those different things, from the state's perspective, I still think the approach, and certainly have others correct me if I'm wrong, is to still leave it open to those individual sort of decision making. Certainly the feds have the NEPA context of things, and they take an integrated approach to that decision making and assessment. And as I said, it varies on the local and the state level. And then there's the Public Utilities Commission, which helps with some of the energy sorts of decisions that you're alluding to. But it doesn't necessarily include, it's not an assessment context. It's more an energy development decision-making body. Other question? Keep forgetting there's other rooms.
Oh, hi, this is Julie from Idaho Falls. I was just wondering, you said kind of early on in your talk that you don't really know the impacts right now of like wind turbines birds and other wildlife. I was wondering, do you know what the current status is on some of the scientific research that's being done on that, where we're at, how soon we might know some things?
Yeah, thank you. So hopefully everybody got that question. I didn't mean to completely say that we don't know anything. We do have information in terms of the potential impacts like wind, that they can have direct mortality to both passerines, to raptors, and to bats, and at various times and for various reasons. A lot of what we lack for information is the ongoing effect. So as wind power develops and more goes out there, what are the implications on a greater scale rather than the individual turbines who we might say, well, we might lose 20 passerines per year, 3 eagles, and 100 bats. And then if we assess that all together, what are the implications of that? And to then assemble the data and information at a scale that we can hopefully make decisions, because so much of that is based on past work that has been fairly site-specific and focused. So we need a broader context to our decision making and a way to stitch that together. And then more of the stuff that we do not know about are the things like, what are bat migration patterns and where are they? Why are male bats more susceptible to the mortality, at least as we found with wind turbines, than other bats? And we just have to build a lot of that. So there are monitoring efforts ongoing with certain wind projects. Again, it depends on the permitting. Usually when we're talking about BLM lands, usually there's before monitoring that goes on to try to help us with the status of the resource and inform exactly what we're dealing with. It's the after construction stuff that's very important in terms of, are the impacts the same as what we predicted, higher or lower, and then how are we adapting? So there is some information, but we've got to develop that quite a bit in terms of the unknowns with birds, passerines, and then in particular, like the hot topic of the moment, sage grouse, and to what effect when we put up turbines on the landscape do the sage grouse avoid it behaviorally, and so in effect are excluded from important habitats that they previously used, and what is the effect on the population? And those are some important questions that we just don't have answers for, and in a biological sense, those are tough questions that take a while to work out. Yeah.
Greg, I guess I commend the emphasis on the adaptive management, but I offer some cautions too, and I would like to respond in relation to like sage grouse. And the caution is that I don't think people are addressing critical trigger points, if you will, that if such and such happens, we're going to adapt and change our management to something else. And I think they're falling back. I've seen it in numerous EISs, RFPs, whatever, that we're going to undertake adaptive management without any emphasis of where are you going to look at those things and when are you going to say, no, we've got to change.
Right. So the question was in reference to the adaptive management idea and the potential shortfalls of that with so how is that going to be enabled over the long term, if I get that right, Neil? And some answer to that. And I agree completely. I think, adaptive management is a process, and so much we like a deliverable. You got your thing, you got your widget, the EIS got done, the project got done, somebody got whatever it is they wanted, and now everybody's moved on to the future. And I appreciate that. And this is one of the things that I think we're struggling with it in terms of fish and wildlife management. And I think it's similar to any of those who, in terms of grazing out on the range and everything else is, I like to think that we're there for the duration. We're not going away. And so then we bring a new wind project in, just using a wind project as an example. It gets built and developed and then it's put on the landscape. It's there for 40 years. I take that as they're part of the crew now. You're on the range as well as the rest of us now. And I don't see it as you suggest, Neil, is abbreviated as might a decision, whether it's a county or the BLM deciding, and then that's done, and there's no change. As we all know, as we manage wildlife, or as a cattleman or a sheep producer adapts to what changes are out there, so I think should the wind if it's part of that same range landscape out there, and we need to build those decisions in there. And at this point, our best opportunities are through the federal NEPA process to try to do that. That's, I think, to the greatest extent we can do it, and I think that has nothing but a potential benefit to all the resources out there, and gets the energy and the project proponents to be a part of our collective efforts to try and live on the range in a sustainable way rather than be a separate thing that stands alone. I think that's something we need to strive for. I agree with you.
This is Bob from Idaho Falls. I have a question. This is Bob from Idaho Falls. Okay. My question is management planning. The resources that you manage don't understand fence lines and don't understand different ownership of lands. What is the department doing for management, especially for long-term management of resources that takes into account the fact that they don't have fence lines that they manage too?
Exactly. I appreciate that. So I think what I would say we're trying to do to the best right now, as I mentioned, is that crucial habitat assessment tool. We're trying to make our data and information readily available, make it so it's quality and credible, and make it so it's boundaryless. It's an ecological map, not some map that's divided by a road, an administrative boundary, a county, a public versus private. And so I hope if we're successful at that, then that should make, as you suggest, those sorts of management decisions maybe more coherent, as two different counties might look at the same kind of information we provide, or as two different states, or public versus private land. That's the best answer I have for answer to your question. Is we're just trying to push that information, develop it as best we can, and then push that out so where it's readily available for helping with those kinds of decisions. That will transcend any of those boundaries, and is the best we can do. Is, again, non-regulatory. We just think that it's a matter of common sense. If that's out there, common sense, and folks will just take it from there and make that happen. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.